Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Learn with Avthar podcast. This is the podcast that helps you become a learning machine. What you're about to hear is a conversation between myself and Shamay Agaron. Shamay is a Princeton-trained neuroscience researcher and science communicator. He's also the author of Friday Brainstorm, a popular newsletter that makes neuroscience accessible and actionable to everyday people like you and I. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably the sort of person who wants to learn new things every day. So what can you look forward to learning from our conversation? We talk about our experience with biofeedback devices and wearables, including a device that reads your brainwaves, which I thought was really cool, so be sure to look out for that. We get into the impact of music and light on our mental states, as well as how food shapes our mood. We also chat about Shamay's experience as a science communicator and share tools that can help you get better at explaining complex ideas, which, speaking from experience, is a critical skill in our constantly innovating world. Now, if you enjoy the Learn with Avthar podcast, be sure to subscribe on YouTube, give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, or simply connect with me through my weekly newsletter. It's an email where you'll discover one thing every week that can change your life. You can find it at avthar.com. That's avthar.com. Now, I hope you have a notebook ready or the Notes app on your phone, because you're going to need it for all the gems dropped in this episode. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with neuroscience communicator Shamay Agaron. Merry Christmas to everyone who's going to be listening to this. We're recording this on Christmas Day. And today I have the pleasure of speaking to my good friend, Shamay. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So Shamay is the author of the Friday Brainstorm newsletter, one of the people who I know who is most interested in neuroscience. And you studied neuroscience at Princeton, right?
I did, yeah. It was really interesting. I studied it from a very theoretical lens there, and I always had an itch to turn it on the practical side and figure out how we can use it as a tool to help us live or to help us just understand ourselves. So yeah, that's kind of what the inspiration was and the background for the newsletter that I started.
Yeah, I think it's really awesome because one thing I like about you is that you're a classic example of someone who, just because your job doesn't necessarily entail something doesn't mean you can't still be interested in it, because you work as a PM, right, in the tech world?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and exactly. It was after graduating school, I just missed have a space to think about neuroscience and think about the brain. And so I love my job and I love what I do, but it didn't have anything to do with science. And so it was a creative outlet and way for me to think through to the same degree that I used to in school on neuroscience, kind of like the field that I really love.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Nice. So in this podcast, we're going to be talking quite a bit about neuroscience topics that we both find very interesting. But before we get into that, I just want to chat a little about like your life and your interest in neuroscience. So what made you want to study neuroscience in university in the first place, just as a background context for the stuff that we're going to talk about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not exactly sure where it really came from, but I remember one of the first things that I was really interested in was personality theory and sort of Myers-Briggs and kind of the Carl Jung who created a theory around that, like personality. And I remember wanting to do research in high school about, correlating like different personality types with what they'd be good at, which I feel like a lot of that exists now. And there's actually like for a while, like a lot of companies try to use personality types to figure out like who they want to hire. And I think that still happens, but basically it was, now I look back and think of that as a very imperfect science. But that's where it all began. And I was really lucky to land in university with a really strong neuroscience program that also was computational. And so got to combine sort of computer science, neuroscience, psychology in a way that I don't think I could have done anywhere else. Yeah, that's where it all came from.
Nice. And you mentioned that like you study neuroscience from a very theoretical perspective. How would you contrast that to the more practical neuroscience? What would be the difference for folks who are not sure about the distinction?
Yeah, so I think that theoretical or basic science means it's science that's done for science's sake, in the sense of some of the questions you're exploring don't have a practical application maybe yet, and you're just trying to push the field forward or learn something very fundamental about how our brain works or how a certain circuit works. Whereas practical neuroscience is very motivated by a certain a certain question that relates to people and helping them in some way, or possibly in a clinical setting, it relates to like neurodegenerative diseases. And so it's a different ball game. And I think oftentimes basic neuroscience starts as something that doesn't have an application. But for example, my advisor at Princeton, his advisor actually was Jeff Hinton, who like began the field of what is now like deep learning and AI and machine learning. That all came from like studying and trying to replicate neuroscience circuits in the brain and trying to model them computationally. Ended up being useful for a lot of other things, clearly. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting how that cycle goes.
Nice. And what would be like examples of the more like applications driven things versus just trying to make breakthroughs in understanding? Would it be like approaching it from a point of view of, okay, I wonder how we can use the brain to help us better understand X phenomena in the real world? Does stuff like that happen, or is it more, okay, let's try and make this incremental advance?
Yeah, I think the best example of that has been machine learning, because machine like it was based on like neural networks, as you can hear in the name, is based on kind of the neural architecture of the brain. I wouldn't say that's ever the initial motivation though, if that makes sense. But I think now more and more now there's a big successful example. People are trying to do that path. Yeah, with practical, it's more in the sense of the stuff that I'm excited about at least is trying to build wearables and things that allow you to monitor your biology or nervous system in real time, connecting that to our devices, or just yeah, so that's one area. And the other area is thinking about kind of technology free, even what are things we can change about our body or the way we're thinking or leading our lives, and how does that affect our cognitive states? And that's a whole other area that is super interesting. And I think everyone can pick up something, and there's something for everybody there.
Totally. We're going to get into those topics in just a moment. I think one of the things that how I got interested in neuroscience, just for the listeners who are interested, was through the topic of learning. So I was very interested in learning when I was in, I guess it's high school. I was in Costa Rica at the time at an international school there, doing my last 2 years of high school. And I started getting into this topic, I guess you would call it today, learning how to learn. Basically, like, how does learning take place? What are these ways that you can hack your learning? Because I wanted to be a better student. And then that naturally led me into the neuroscience of learning, because I think once you go past the tips and the tricks and things, you start to wonder, how does this all work? Like, why does it? For example, one of the hacks that I learned is you should read all the questions on your exam first and start working on the hardest ones before you do the easy ones. And I was like, why does it work? What is the mechanism behind that in the brain? And so similar to you with like personality theory, that was my gateway drug into neuroscience. And I've been interested now in applications to, as you mentioned, living better, health, exercise, and just being like happy and peaceful. So we're gonna get into a lot of that.
Yeah.
I thought we could start on the wearables, because we both have experience with wearables and biofeedback in different ways. One of the motivators for doing this podcast was my experience with the glucose monitoring in the glucose monitoring space, with levels and wearing a continuous glucose monitor. You have been experimenting with a headset that can actually detect your brain waves. Is that right? How does that work?
Yeah, so it's a headset called it's made by a company called Neuroscience, and it mimics a research device that is used in a lot of neuroscience labs, where it sits on your head, and they're kind of non-invasive electrodes, so it doesn't like pierce your skin at all, but it detects what is the electric activity happening on the more surface level areas of your brain. And based on that, it's a pretty rough picture from time to time, but you can actually piece apart things from that. And yeah, the idea is bringing it outside the lab. What can we start to do with it? And if people start wearing this more and more, it doesn't have to be a headset. There are ways of integrating it into headphones, for example, where people might way more naturally wear it all day. What implications does that have on how they live, and how does that integrate into everyday life? Yeah.
Totally. I know one of the things that got me into kind of wearables and neuroscience was sleep. So I was an early adopter into things like the Aura Ring and the Whoop strap and stuff like that. And I think that wearables have always been associated with or at least the early adopters were people in like health and fitness, and now, or fitness and performance more. And then now it's becoming very much health focused. I remember listening to a podcast with Matthew Walker, where he was explaining how in his sleep lab, he would basically, I think it's fMRI or some sort of brain imaging technology to detect what states of sleep people are in based on the brain waves that are going on, and how the wearables today, for example, like I wear Aura Ring, and these ones can't really do that. So it's very interesting that these guys have managed to make a headset that can actually, you said, detect like the surface level activity in the brain. How powerful is that? What can you actually get? What information can you actually get from wearing so the device is called the Notion, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. Basically, the two main signals that it gives you right now is calm and focus. And so it allows you to track some level. I think focus and attention are very vague words. And so it measures in a very narrow sense. And it's maybe a little different from each person, but still like consistently within yourself. It allows you to measure in this hour when I was wearing it, how focused was I relative to that other session I had yesterday. I think what's interesting about this is, as you said, a lot of these devices and wearables started in the health and kind of athletic spaces because these people take kind of their biology and nervous system really seriously.
Yeah.
There's only so much you can push yourself as an athlete physically. At some point, it becomes a mental game.
Yeah. And anything you can do to get an edge, you're going to want to experiment with it.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think what's really interesting is that's where it started, but now we're seeing it proliferating into the larger world. And what I'm really excited about personally, and this might sound like a dystopia to some people, depending on how you look at it, but like the reason why it didn't apply outside of athletics, because athletics is easily measurable in some sense, right? Like on an individual level, for example, in track, like you can measure how fast you went on 200-meter track, and you can benchmark your progress. That wasn't really possible in outside that context for a long time. And now with the Notion being able to measure your attention and other wearables being able to benchmark different indicators of health and biomarkers, you can start to, by measuring it, make more intentional progress and set goals like how do I want to improve or how do I want to change what's happening. What I'm excited for is a lot of people are quote unquote like knowledge workers these days, meaning they think a lot and they're paid based on their ability to focus and do work for their company that's most of the time cognitive. And I think more and more we're going to see people who take this to almost an athletic level and that they take it very seriously, kind of how in the same way that an athlete would sleep before a big game and kind of really take care of that, you would have knowledge workers that really take seriously their levels of focus throughout the day, how they're using their time, and really be intentional about that. And I think that's, for some people, they look at it and wow, that means that now like our companies will measure everything about us and rate us by our focus. But I think there's also a future where it doesn't have negative implications and just lets people be more efficient at their time and do things and get things done in less time and allow themselves more time for leisure in their day, which I think is really cool.
I actually think it's a very interesting idea. I always imagine having a dashboard in the future of all my different, I guess you could have a bunch of sensors in your body. I would have one for, let's just take the ones that I have now, one for glucose levels, one for like how you slept last night, your heart rate. And then you could have another one for like your brain activity. I'm not sure about the specific things that you would measure, but maybe, for example, what percentage of time were you in this kind of brain state? I actually think that's really interesting if it's applied at an individual level, because I know someone like myself, I've done different experiments around how my diet affects my focus and kind of mental state. I think this is something that I got really inspired by this podcast that I've plugged a few times before, called the Strong Fit podcast. And basically what these guys are into is how can you better understand human physiology? And I guess their goal is more for performance. So these are guys who are into like CrossFit and strongman and stuff like that. But in my application, similar to what you're saying, like I'm a knowledge worker like yourself. And at the end of the day, the more creative leaps that you can make and the easier you can make it for you to do work, the better it's going to be for you at the end of the day. No one wants to struggle the whole day. You don't want to make things more difficult for yourself. And an easy example is when you eat protein during the day and how your body reacts to that can actually affect how alert you are. And I guess the reasoning behind it is that when you have things like, let's just take the various food groups. So you have protein, fats, and carbohydrates, just to
Yeah.
keep it simple. When you have carbohydrates, because it's easily metabolized, that would usually put you into a sympathetic state. And I guess you should probably explain this, but a sympathetic state is more like when you're excited. It's usually associated with things like fight, flight, and freeze, or fight, flight, and freeze. You're really buzzed and you're ready to like do something. You want to take action. Whereas when you have protein, because it requires so much of digestion, the ideal state for that and what it pushes the body towards is a parasympathetic state, which is more kind of rest and relax, rest and digest. Yeah, that's the phrasing. And so it's interesting about you think about what you have for breakfast, then becomes an interesting thing because it actually affects how you think about what am I going to eat. You're not just eating for pleasure, but you're eating for what happened in the past, but you're also eating for what you're going to do in the next 3 to 5 hours of your day. If the next 3 to 5 hours is going to be relaxing, socializing, then I'm like more likely to have protein. That's usually at the end of the day. It has to do with circadian rhythms as well, which we're going to touch on in a few minutes. With things like fats, then becomes a good fuel for focus. If you have maybe like your very good fat foods like your cheese or your cream, or there's other ones that avocados that people like, that can usually be a good fuel for focus. And I found that in my own life, things like experimenting with fasting, where you're not eating anything and you're not having any input from food, that actually has produced some of the most clear mind states versus, and it's funny when I experienced this when I was working in an office previously. You're stuck on something and your immediate reaction is to go and get like some of the snacks. So it's like chocolate or sweets or something. And that actually is counterproductive to your focus, because that puts you in a sympathetic state and you're just looking there for a fix rather than working on the problem that you're doing, and that actually is affecting your productivity.
Yeah.
So it's super interesting about like when you think about it from a neuroscience perspective, just from those states, if you can have something that says, hey, like this is that can actually recommend to you based on the data that it has, that can actually help you live better. And I think if it's used from an individual level versus like a company all big brother monitoring everyone's productivity levels, that could be huge. Because I think like in my experience, the reason why I have like glucose monitors and stuff like that is really to, if you can understand how things change over time, that can give you a huge insight into what interventions can you make. And it's basically studying, being very intentional about what you're doing, and are like the defaults of your habits actually getting you closer to where you want to go, or are you making things like unnecessarily difficult for yourself?
Yeah. I think it takes a certain person, to be fair, to be really into kind of quantifying everything and trying to make small adjustments. And me and you are definitely those kind of people. And so I already know that many of my friends are just like, this seems like a lot of work and I'm just not going to do it. But yeah, I think even if people don't engage to the extent of buying a glucose monitor and trying to read in the data and like figure out insights from it, for example, with food, people don't put enough thought into kind of the food they consume and how it affects them. You're totally right. Like some basic facts that like really help it guide how you eat food is like protein takes 6 hours to digest usually, whereas carbohydrates takes 2 hours. And if you know that, for example, a basic fact about neuroscience, there, as you said, this sympathetic and parasympathetic state, basically one is your active state and one is your kind of resting state. If what sort of things put you in one or the other, you can be way more intentional about priming yourself and setting yourself up for success if you're trying to do a podcast or write something or give a presentation, right? Like you're only hurting yourself by not knowing that and relying on food, as you said, as not even for hunger, but a way to replace like discomfort in your life.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a crutch. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
In my own life, I recently found that so a lot of people experience this like post-lunch dip in their productivity where they just like feel really sleepy, and it really bothered me. I don't like feeling that way, and so I realized if I cut carbohydrates out of my lunch, like this is very particular to me and maybe to other people, it seems, I don't get that dip. And yeah, that really changed the way I like look at things and made me way more intentional about it. And I think because when you're younger, your body is just way more malleable or flexible, you only
Exactly.
start to notice the real effects of this as you grow older. And that's why people in their 40s and 50s are way more careful about what they eat and
Yeah.
know, like, I'm not going to eat this, going to put me to sleep. Whereas when you're in your teens and 20s, when a lot of your habits around food form, it really doesn't matter. Like you'll probably be fine no matter what you
Exactly.
eat to some
Yeah,
extent.
like I'm thinking about like at Princeton, we used to have late meal and things, which is all this you could get like burgers and fries and stuff like that. And then you'd eat that and you'd be like, yeah, I'm going to focus and study. And sometimes, I think looking back, there were some times where I just powered through, but sometimes where it did affect me and you just thought, hey, there's something wrong with me. I can't focus. Versus I just ate this huge meal of all different things and my body is like confused about what am I trying to do and trying to digest this and to get it out of my system versus like just focusing and stuff like that. Or you feel like really jittery and you want to do stuff because you had a bunch of sugar or you had like ice cream or something like that. And so that's super interesting. I think one other thing that you touched upon is these like noticing how different things have an effect on your desired state. Because I think now, especially even with people working from home and things like that, you realize like having certain environmental cues and whatnot can also be hugely impactful on your productivity or just like how you feel. Like a lot of people struggle with turning it off at the end of the day because you're in the same environment the whole day. And another thing that fascinated me a lot with the brain is this concept of our associations with different environments and how it helps to separate out your activities in different places. You have a certain place where you just work. And this is another reason why Matthew Walker says you shouldn't do anything else in your bed except for sleep.
Yeah.
Um, because otherwise you're creating conflicting associations with Netflix and sleep. And so you're lying in your bed trying to sleep, but then your body is saying like, oh, where's the Netflix? Like I'm used to having Netflix in this place. So it's
Right.
another example of that. How
Yeah,
have actually, oh, go ahead.
you can ask the
I was going to say, how
question.
have you like managed with working from home and trying to create those routines or associations so you can delineate between work and play?
Yeah.
Have you used like any neuroscience to help you do that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Like thinking about how environment affects us is something that I'm so like I've come back to this question in so many different ways. And just to answer your question, one thing that I've been just has made a big difference is I go to a co-working space a couple of days a week usually, and it's very important for my routine to go on Monday because that mentally divides the weekend from the weekday, if that makes sense. Because usually I'm working in my room, and then at that point it doesn't feel any different. It like almost doesn't matter if the rest of the week I spend at home, as long as I have that like one marker that tells my brain like, hey, like this is work now, like a separate routine than you had over the past 2 days. That's been really huge. And obviously people might not have a chance or have different COVID sensitivities. And so they haven't been able to do that. But I think even changing rooms has a huge effect on the way that you work and the habits that you have, kind of the mental habits your brain falls into. Another one that I've recently been digging deep into is light. So
Yeah.
people don't think at all about their indoor light situation. I think that's something that obviously you hear that in the winter people get less light, so the sun sets at 4:30 days. And so commonly like you should take vitamin D and stuff like this. But this almost avoids the bigger problem of like if the light is dark starting at 4:30 and in your home you don't have proper lighting, for example, like there's all kinds of effects to talk about here, but for example, blue light makes you very alert and energetic, and so that's
Yeah.
why it's bad to look at your phone before bed, because that has a really strong effect, like alerting effect on you, and like delay sleep,
Yeah.
whereas warm light has the opposite, where it encourages that in a sense. And most people look like a lot of advice is around limiting blue light at night, but
Yeah.
not enough is about like increasing it between the hours of 4:30 and whenever you want to finish working, because I get the sense a lot of my friends like just really their energy level drops around that time. They have no
Hmm.
idea why, and nobody even thinks, could it be like the lighting in my room is 100 times like more dim than the sun, would be in the summer. And so that must have some effect on you. So that's one thing I'm big on. Then music as well, I think we have such strong associations with it, especially if you listen to music a lot. And uh, I think it's such a great way to push yourself to different mental states, and just understanding very basic principles around how music tends to affect you. Like the simplest thing that I think everyone can learn is the, like, tempo of music, right? If it's fast
Hmm.
tempo, it's usually energetic and will increase your energy in some sense when you're listening to it. And so if you're feeling a little lethargic, like that can be such a quick way to just prime your brain into becoming more focused, as well as other things. For one thing that I always bring up is that people like to listen to lyrical music when they're working, and that works in certain settings, but it interferes, since you're hearing words, it interferes with any task that has to do with words. So if you're
Yeah.
reading, if you're writing, if you're talking, like all these things will be, all these things will interfere with the music. And so I just think just learning these little things about how your environment affects you in the different ways goes such a long way in terms of just living life, and making it really easy to be focused, actually.
There's
But
so much to
yeah,
there's so much to unpack there.
yeah,
Let's start with light because I have questions and also just things to contribute on each one of those. So
sure.
on light, I recently invested. They're not super expensive, but I've got these like Philips Hue color changing light bulbs in my apartment,
Yeah,
and I think I got into light from this whole thing we are talking about circadian rhythms, understanding that your body, what actually activates the alert state in the morning versus, and how that kind of affects one, like how you're feeling, and two, like how can you actually wind down in the evening? Because I think my
yeah,
biggest issue, as with a lot of type A kind of people, is how do you turn it off at the end of the day? You can focus, but then you want to relax, you want to enjoy
yeah,
your time away from work and not be stressing about things or unable to turn the monkey mind off. And so that's been good, like just setting a routine where, at a certain time, the lights, one, get dimmer, but also a lot warmer. And this was difficult for me in the States as well, because like I grew up in a country where we didn't have any daylight savings. And South Africa, it's like bright all the time. It's a very sunny
yeah,
country. So we never had any seasonal affective disorder. And we would hear stories about people. My uncle spent some time in London, and he would tell me like, yeah, in the winter people get like really sad, and I was like, oh, they're sad because like they don't have sunlight, and like that's really funny. But now when you understand the biochemical basis for that, it makes a lot of sense. Maybe that's why English people are very straightforward and angry all the time,
could
and
be.
people from California are all happy-go-lucky. But yeah, just waking up earlier and going for a walk first thing in the morning to like get that kind of light into your eyes, that's something that I've done on occasions that's really helped. Not just walking, because that gets your whole body going before you, because I think sometimes, especially with work from home, it can be tempting to get up, brush your teeth, and you straight into emails or like at your desk or something, like having that thing in
Yeah.
between. But I'm curious, you said that using more blue light rather than less blue light when you're trying to focus, when you have those dips. Is that what you were trying to allude to, or have I got that wrong?
Yeah, no, definitely. And what I mean there is sort of, let's contrast the summer and the winter. Like in the summer, let's say you work 10 to 6. There would be sunlight throughout that period. And so
Yep.
you wouldn't really have a dip at the end of the day. Whereas in the winter, right around 4:30, it's dark outside. And you might not notice it, but that has an influence on your level of focus in a sense. And most people don't try to counteract that. And all I mean is, if you invest in strong lighting in your workplace or your home, then you could emulate the sun how it would be in the summertime until you're ready to kind of finish working, if that makes sense. So if
Hmm.
that means like working till 7, and then once you're done working, just shutting it off or turning to a warmer light, even that, think about how much that probably helps you turn off in a certain sense, because you have such an association with like bright blue light for working. And really, if you imagine like hospital lights, that's what that's for in a sense, like keeping these medical professionals really awake. And
Yeah. You don't want
but
to
how
walk
like
into like a
annoying.
warm, inviting hospital,
Yeah,
like
like,
people.
and so a lot of thought has been put into that, and that's to make the medical professionals alert, and so they make less mistakes, and we can learn from that. And I don't think anybody likes hospital lighting, and I'm not saying to replicate that in your home, but to increase the light exposure you have has a big effect. And I think in the morning too, something that people don't appreciate enough is that a lot of people like sleep with blackout shades because light affects them a lot in the night, and so they need that. But one drawback to that is that in the morning, when usually with the sun rising would slowly get light pouring into your room, you don't get that anymore.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is like biochemically, I don't know exactly what is produced, but basically the chemical that like slowly like wakes you up is activated by light exposure in the
Yes.
mornings. And so it's much easier. You're probably going to feel much groggier if you just wake up from an alarm and there's no light in your room, as opposed to slowly, like the Philips Hue, for example, they try to incorporate circadian lighting where you can set a timer where it starts to turn on right as
Yeah.
your alarm rings, so that you can prep your body for waking up rather than like rudely just shaking it out of like sleep. And to your body, like we evolved in a time where everything was based around the cycles of sunlight and night. And so trying to replicate that even artificially goes a long way.
100%. Even we're going to bring up Andrew Huberman later on. But one of the things that I learned from his podcast is like the effect of, and this has been going around in some of the other like new agey podcasts that I listen to around health and fitness, but just like waking up to an alarm and how that puts you in a sympathetic state. Because imagine if your alarm sound is like the classic buzzer, yeah, yeah, yeah. What's going on? What do I have to do? You're up, you immediately activated. Then you're like drinking coffee, like that puts you immediately into like sympathetic and you're like, oh, ready to go. And in some cases, look, you might have to do that on certain days, but to do that every day of your life, that really puts a huge toll on you versus waking up. And also most people check their phone first things in the morning, and that already primes your brain for anxiety and puts you in a dopamine deficient state where you see some pictures that you like and then like, oh, damn, I got to go to work. You don't feel motivated versus waking up naturally to sunlight or without an alarm in an ideal case. I haven't been able to do this. It's one of the things that I want to try and do. Not looking at your phone first thing in the morning, maybe going for a walk outside or just like sitting by yourself a little bit and then going about your day. I think those kind of the natural wake up phase, I think is very interesting. Two things I'm interested in. One is the wake up phase and then the sleep routine in the evenings. I think the sleep routine has gotten a lot more press in the past couple of years. Yeah, there's Ariana Huffington writing about sleeping well at night and stuff like that. But the wake up, I think, that might come pretty soon. One of the other things I want to touch on is on the topic of music. I think I read about this in the book escapes me right now. But just think about like when you walk into an H&M or some sort of, I guess, a shop, you don't hear calm classical music. You're hearing like pop music, energetic, to get you into a state where you're like, oh, I'm excited. These clothes are cool. Let me buy this. So all the stuff, like advertising industry has figured out a lot of the effects of subtle things like lighting and music. If you look at a very high-end store, the lighting, the music is very different than a store that's like fast fashion or something like that. All those are designed to push you towards a certain direction, to have certain ideas about what's going on in the shop. And so it's interesting to see like how can you apply those principles to not work against you, to try and persuade you to buy something that you might not need, but to actually help you be more focused, more productive, and just have a better life.
I think there are two sides to that coin. One is like being aware of it just helps you know what's going on when you walk into a store like that and not be as susceptible, because almost like just knowing the trick is, oh, I feel very excited right now and a lot of energy, but it's not because like their clothes are objectively really exciting. It's because they're manipulating my psychology in a way. But as you said, understanding that and thinking about how you can almost trick yourself into persuading yourself into a cognitive state that you want to be in. And I think there's a limit to that to some extent. Like one of the things about circadian rhythms, like people often think about a 24-hour cycle. There are also these things called ultradian rhythms, which are more on the scale of 2 hours essentially. And it's sort of like your peaks and troughs of energy throughout the day.
Yeah.
And like trying to push yourself for multiple hours, it works against your biology just as much as like other things do. And so one startup that I've really been looking into, they're called Endel. They create personalized soundscapes. So I differentiate between soundscapes and music in the sense that it's not really music. They use like seed motifs and different like series of notes, and then an AI algorithm remixes it, and it's continuous and like never ends, and it sounds like it would be kind of drony and uninteresting. They actually made it very artistic. They are the first AI music producing to be signed by a major label.
Oh,
Their
wow.
their
Okay.
AI was signed by Warner, which is a weird thing to think about, but
Yeah.
there you go. This is where, and they try not to name themselves music because that's not really what they are. A soundscape is just like almost like a sound environment.
Yeah.
And the thing that's really interesting about them is that they are trying to personalize it to you. And so their whole thing is based on circadian rhythms, but also these ultradian rhythms in the sense that the soundscape will tell you when and intensify and increase its tempo when you're at your peak of energy and dwindle down and be a little more calm when you're at your troughs, and indicate to you in one sense, hey, like maybe relax a bit now and reflect on where you should be throughout your day generally. It also takes in inputs like heart rate, for example. And so you could think that like it could keep your heart rate. If your heart rate goes down, let's say that means you're more calm, like you're not in aroused or like this like focused state anymore.
Yeah.
It could speed up. And there's research showing that like if the music you're listening to is like slightly above your heart rate, will slowly like rise to match it. And so I think it's really interesting because they're building something that's meant to almost help you manage your energy throughout the day through music. And yeah, they've been, to tie back to what you were saying earlier about shops, they've been partnering with a lot of different labels and different companies. So they partnered with a airline, like a Japanese airline, where they designed a personalized soundscape for them to get their like passengers into a really relaxed, like sleepy, good mood.
I can see
flight.
what that works well on a flight because you have some flights are super long. So yeah.
And it's sort of like very background, so you can keep it on without bothering anyone. In the same sense, they partner with like stores as well to generate personalized soundscapes for them and really think about what sort of mood do they want and how do they want to manifest that in the store.
Super
so
interesting.
I think it's really cool what they're doing.
Yeah, because I know that it reminds me of people use the Pomodoro technique or something like that to inject these breaks into their work. But this is taking it a step further where you have like a music association with it. And as we mentioned before, sound and the brain, the effect of sound on your brain and on your state is so immense. There's a wonderful book that I'm still reading, I haven't finished it, called Your Brain on Music, which my friend who's a musician, he plays the Indian, it's called the tabla. It's like Indian drums that you play like sitting down. And he was telling me like, we had a conversation about how I listen to a lot of like Indian classical music when I'm working. And it has a similar characteristic to what you're mentioning, where it starts off very slow. And then as the song goes on, these songs are sometimes like 1-2 hours long or 1 hour long, let's just say. And as it continues, it gets faster and faster until it builds to like the climax at the end. And what I usually do is loop them, where once the song has got into the high point, I then take a break and then you come back and you start again. And so it's interesting, that might be why it works so well for me. But another thing I'm interested there on the sound point is like listening to the same thing over and over again. I'm not sure if you've experienced this, but one thing that I do is either just keep the same song on loop. And when you're talking about the songs with lyrics, one of my friends was actually telling me this, that he listens to music in another language. In this case, so he's, I think, American, you wouldn't say American Indian, but his family is from India, but he doesn't understand Hindi. So he would listen to Hindi music and I don't understand any of the lyrics, but I like to listen to it because it's in the background, it like the sounds, but it's not interfering with my like language processing part because I don't know what any of this means.
That's a great strategy, actually. Yeah, I often listen to foreign music for that purpose because oftentimes like instrumental music doesn't inspire the same emotional response that lyrical music does.
Yeah,
in a
because of
sense,
the pitch of the voice and things.
Yeah, and so it's like a little hack. Like you could not interfere with your language processing because your brain doesn't understand it and almost perceives it as sound more than it does like language or words.
Yes.
But at the same time, it still carries that same emotional weight. And emotion is like, apart from arousal or your alertness level, emotion is the other kind of spectrum to think about. And oftentimes kind of making yourself putting yourself in a positive mood is more amenable to creativity and just working and being able to focus compared to a negative mood. And lyrical music tends to help with that a lot, actually.
Exactly. One of the other things I just want to mention, we can switch topics after this, is so I listen to this type of music in, I think the word for it is called kirtan, where basically you have a certain mantra or you just have lyrics that's repeated over and over again.
Yeah.
And it's a similar quality with some of these like Indian classical ones where it starts off slow and then it gets faster and faster. But because it's the same lyrics, and it's repeated, you stop listening to it. It's playing, but it fades into the background a little bit. And what remains is just like the emotion of the person's voice and the tempo of the music and stuff like that. And it's interesting how a lot of people report that like they have like great like religious experiences being in that environment, like when people are singing and they're playing instruments and stuff like that. I usually use it for like long periods of work that I have to do. So there'll be like an hour each and I'd loop them such that's like the only song I'd listen to during the day. And it's so interesting how so this thing has been around for, I'd say hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, depending on, probably not thousands of years, I don't know, but it's been around for a long time.
Right.
And it's funny how like we're seeing why this kind of thing works now versus previously where people are like, oh yeah, this is just like what we do. It's nice, like it works. Whereas now there's like actually scientific explanations for, oh wow, this is actually why this is a good, it produces these kinds of peak experiences.
No, I think that's totally true. And there's so much to be learned from sort of anything that stood the test of time and has been around for thousands of years. Like there must be something to it, right? Like maybe they can't explain from a scientific perspective how it works, but like they have an intuition and they over time, they through trial and error times 100 have figured out, hey, this sort of music really inspires XYZ emotion people or like religious mind state. And yeah, I think that one other thing that we're interested in from the same realm is like acupuncture and Ayurvedic medicine, this kind of stuff that's mostly labeled as like pseudoscience in today's world. And I think it's a shame because there are some aspects to it that don't really work and might relate to pseudoscience, but there is a lot of wisdom in it and it does work. We just don't have the right paradigm to understand it with today's kind of tools and the way we usually think about biology and science. And I actually think that my hot take for the next like 20, 30 years that we're going to start to understand the science behind these things and it'll completely transform how healthcare is done in the Western world. And I'm so excited for that because my family comes from an Eastern culture where they have relied on these sort of remedies. And for a long time, going to school, I was always conflicted thinking we're taught this one thing in school and we're taught that this is all a kind of bullshit. But at the same time, I do feel better from all these therapies and alternative treatments. Yeah, so it's really interesting how things that have been around for thousands of years are like shrugged off by people, but they wouldn't be around for this long if they hadn't worked. Like people,
exactly.
Like there's no motivation to keep it going if it does nothing for people.
Exactly. Nassim Taleb has this concept of what is Lindy. It's what has been around for a long time. If something has been effective, or say like a building has been around for 1,000 years, on expectation, you can predict that it's going to be around for another 1,000 of years. And so similarly with these kinds of treatments, some of them, and I think there's two explanations that you can have. So you put forth one, whereas one way to explain this is the resolution with which we can see and with which our tools can measure, and like the paradigm that we have isn't sufficient or isn't complex enough, or we don't have the right tools to actually understand it. And so we dismiss it because it's a limitation of our tools and our current thinking at the time. You see this a lot with like meditation nowadays, where previously meditation is like this kind of woo thing, like people never understood it. But now they've put like monks under brain imaging and scanning their brains while they're meditating, and they're understanding what's actually going on, what kind of brain waves are going on with these people. And so that's an example where the technology has actually caught up to help explain this practice that's been around
for thousands of years.
Exactly. So that's super interesting. And there's another one, which I think, again, it's probably has to do with like the tools not being powerful enough, but I think it's equally interesting. So it's this idea of the placebo effect. And a lot of people think of the placebo effect as this thing is, oh, it's placebo, so it doesn't actually work. But if you think about medicine, and the way it's conducted today, it's all about that whole thing about how effective is it compared to a placebo. That's the whole like double blind randomized controlled trials. That's like the gold standard in medicine. And for a lot of these things, if a placebo is actually just as effective or more effective versus some sort of drug or some sort of medicine that you would develop, then that's actually effective. So in a lot of these things, for example, like if you believe something is going to work, whether it's, so obviously like acupuncture, there's new explanations for it, but there's certain things around like Ayurvedic medicine or certain meditation or breathing practices or things that you do. If someone is actually in the mindset that actually can work, there's been studies that have shown, so there's a wonderful book that explains this in great detail called Suggestible You by Eric Vance. So I'd point people to that to learn more about it. But that actually shows that these things can be effective because of the sheer belief that people believe it's going to be effective, versus when people are, then there's also the opposite effect called the nocebo effect, where when people believe that they're taking something harmful to them, their bodies will actually have that harmful negative effect, even though it's just like a sugar pill or even though it's just nothing in the beginning. So it's actually leads to the topic of like how powerful the mind is and how powerful like your expectation of things are. And I've never been someone to be like, like it's the secret, you got to like manifest things and stuff like that. But that kind of the brain is a very powerful prediction machine, and the more you can work with it to get the outcomes that you want. And obviously there's certain things where like drugs or medicine. It's funny, in America, people say drugs when they mean medicine, whereas like in South Africa, drugs are like, cocaine and marijuana and stuff. But medicine in this case, where it's actually much more effective, and you should probably go with it there. But with these kinds of alternate treatments, there are cases where it might actually be warranted, and there's a scientific explanation for why.
Yeah, two thoughts there. I guess the golden standard for all clinical trials today is this double-blind procedure. And the basic idea, like simply explained, is that like both the researchers and the subjects don't know whether they're getting a placebo or a treatment, and treatment is just like whatever drug it is. And then they conduct a statistical test to see if there's really a difference between the placebo and the treatment. And it is really effective in terms of how we currently conceptualize of medicine. From in like biology, there's real emphasis on kind of molecules and how they like interact, and drugs. There's a lot of emphasis on drug discovery, and there, to some degree, there's like financial reasons for that. It's very profitable. What's less profitable is understanding how changes like this idea of proactive versus reactive medicine. Like I think in the West, it's very reactive, kind of giving drugs to amend a problem, versus taking a step back and thinking about like how can we prevent this in the first place. And a good example that I like to use to contrast our current paradigm in medicine versus the Eastern, what would be better to understand the Eastern treatments is, in science, we actually learned about like the properties of light a lot in the past 100 years. And for a long time, people thought it was a wave. It was a wave that travels and hits our eyes, and that's how we see light. And the big discovery in the past 100 years was that light also sometimes behaves as like a particle, like a molecule almost. And it's almost, it like behaves in two different ways based on different, like the conditions and scenarios. And it's really hard to get your mind around the fact that light can be both a wave and a particle, because those seem like mutually exclusive things. And so to tie that into kind of current medicine, I think our medicine views everything as a particle, whereas a lot of Eastern medicines are based on looking at the body as something that emits electromagnetic fields and biophotonic fields, and thinking about it from a wave perspective. And one of the most interesting books I've read recently by John Leaf, it's called The Secret Language of Cells. And it goes into all that we learned about how cells communicate with each other, not only through molecules, but also through kind of the fields they emit to exchange information. And that's something that like until in the 21st century, before then, has not been explored almost at all. And I think that's going to be the key to understanding sort of a lot of these alternative treatments. And one way that it's already becoming big is all these companies that are focusing on like gut-brain axis. In other words, like how your gut and like the bacteria within your intestines have actually a large influence on how you think and your health in general. That's something that nobody like intuitively doesn't make any sense, but everything is interconnected and decentralized, and it's not like your mind is the only thing that like contributes to thinking and processing. And that's
100%.
something we're
Yeah.
only learning about now, which in my mind will completely turn over how we think about health and disease in the future.
100%. It reminds me of, on the topic of like the gut brain connection, a lot of most of the experimentation that I've done has been just on myself with like diet and like reading different studies about the effect of diet on the different outcomes. So one of them that I read was about the effect of like certain, I guess it's like diets where you like remove certain foods. I forget the technical term for it, but things like the carnivore diet or something like that. And they found that if you do stuff like that, you can actually starve certain bacteria in the gut that would cause you to want to crave certain foods. But if you starve them for sufficiently long, that will then change, i.e., what foods you want to eat, because you no longer have a majority of that bacteria. And you think about like something as simple as, what do I want to eat? How is that determined? You obviously think, oh, I'm a very rational person, like I have total control over what I'm desiring to eat right now. But actually it's about what bacteria you have in your gut, and that kind of leans you to a certain way. And so it's wonderful that there's all these new different ways of explaining things that we previously just didn't have any insight to.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting about now, like I think we often think like a lot of these things have to do with like willpower and sheer like force of determination and stuff like that when it comes to behavioral change. But you can actually see that it's much more complex than just, if you want to do something, do it. There's a lot more factors in play.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's about viewing your body as an environment of its own, how you're treating it, like what inputs you're putting into it. I think a lot of the problems in kind of Western countries, the US, for example, with obesity, for a long time, people were thinking about, okay, how, like, what, like, can we scan the brain and find, representations for why certain people might be more, I guess, it might be more likely to become obese. But really, what we haven't been looking at is, what if it has to do with just your gut microbiome? Like, what if that's like where we need to look? And I think that's going to be super exciting, because a lot of the food that we put in, there's this phrase like, you are what you eat. And it's silly, but in a very real way, like, you influence a lot about how your mind views food and craves food. And it's not even your mind anymore. You can think about like the bacteria in your gut as part of you and their cravings as well, as you said. So I feel very lucky in the sense that I was raised in a household where it was always fruits and vegetables over any junk food. And growing up now, like, I just don't have any cravings for that. Obviously it's good. I can't say that I don't enjoy it from time to time, but if it's not around, like, I'm not going to seek it out. And I've just met a lot of people who have never had a salad in their life, and there's so much like nurture that comes in this, like what habits you built into your life as you were being raised that are even out of your control because at some point you were a kid, and how that plays into your habits later in life. And I think like an important thing for me has been taking stock of what has been negative and positive in my upbringing. What do I want to continue to support, and what do I want to break down and rethink in a sense? Yeah, I think it's an important process.
100%, especially when you think about the kind of lifestyles that we live right now. So I think there was a book about how, I can't remember the title. I'll look it up and put it in the show notes. But it's basically about like how the regional diet from where you or your ancestors used to live or something could be like an optimal diet for you. And I think about it in the context of the kind of Indian food that I grew up eating, and the effect that the shift towards more a sedentary lifestyle has had on that, where, usually people, you're doing like very physical stuff, you have quite an active day, whereas now if you're sitting down the whole day, that thing no longer works. So it's all about how do you, again, think about the habits that you have picked up and whether they're still serving you in the context that you are today. It's interesting because like you'd see there's like YouTube videos about what Michael Phelps eats on a daily basis and how many thousands of calories he has. And when you think about the output that he produces swimming in the pool hours in the day, it makes sense to eat that much. Whereas if you're just sitting and like on the computer and like maybe you have a workout once a day, your intake and the stuff that you're going to need to perform is going to be different. And so it's all about that, what's working in your context and how can you undo those bad habits or replace them with better ones. And one thing that came to mind as well that I want to mention is you mentioned earlier that a lot of our society today is driven by that need to create a product out of something or to profit from it. Yeah. It's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to make money from like fasting and meditation. Certain companies have tried, like this Headspace and stuff like that, making it more accessible. But it's very difficult to make money from fasting because like you have a supplement to help you fast and there's no diet food service that you can try and push people on.
A friend of mine literally just started a startup that's based on a pill to help you fast.
Oh, wow. Okay. Maybe I'm out of the loop on that one then. Yeah. But the idea is that like a lot of the things that we want today is very much what can I take to help me with this versus most of the, and you don't see that because they don't have any marketing dollars behind it, where some of the best remedies, like you think about, there was a discussion when the COVID vaccine was still being developed about, what are the things we've seen how COVID has affected America, mainly because a lot of the people have a predisposition to it because of the unhealthy lifestyles that a lot of Americans live. A lot of people are obese, a lot of people don't eat well. And so that increases the likelihood of being affected by COVID. And so there was certain discussions going on. People are like, if this is the real public health outcome, it's not just about, should you take the vaccine? Is it effective? But how can you actually change your lifestyle? Isn't it, recommending more exercise, recommending healthier foods, a matter of public health versus should you get vaccinated or not? Obviously, that's like a different discussion, but dealing with the root cause of why are so many people predisposed and in this high risk category. So it says what you're saying, you need to be careful about just looking at what's being sold to you. Because a lot of the industry, you see this a lot in health and fitness and the supplements industry, and now in like the whole like wellness and medical industry, where whatever can be sold to you is the thing that you will hear about versus the thing that can actually solve the root cause that might not be sexy to market. Fasting is like one example.
Definitely. Yeah, you're completely right. It's financial incentives involved and what you end up seeing. And then on a societal level, right, like politicians, you have to play a long game to change, like to implement a policy where over time you change the population's behavior around health and how they view exercise and things like this. But it's not going to help you get reelected in the next cycle. And so
100%.
You just have to think about like, it's not their fault. It just, they need quick solutions to point to. So the next time they're being reelected, they can think about that. And this happens everywhere, not just like that. But recently in New York City, for me, for example, there's like this completely irrelevant, but there's this like system of specialized high schools, and there used to be a test to test into them, which led to a lot of inequity and problems with diversity. And you have to think that like the real solution here is to increase access to this test and allow people to prepare and invest in the earlier like elementary schools and do that. But that'll take decades to actually proliferate. So instead, for political gain, they change the system to make it diverse, but it doesn't really change anything about any of the inputs that you have into the system. Like you still have kids that maybe have like teachers that are struggling or they themselves don't have enough resources to teach the kids. And so all of this is to say, I think it's good to be aware of the incentive structures that exist in society, both on a private level, also on a public level, and think about, how is information being filtered to you and how should you seek out to proactively do things rather than seek out that easy solution.
Totally. I did a podcast for the listeners who want to learn more about this with regards to education. By the time this is out, there's a big episode with someone called Nick Vogue, who is one of the directors for teaching and learning at Princeton, and how this manifests itself in education, especially in the university environment. So I encourage folks to check that out. I want to talk about one of the things that we definitely wanted to touch on, which was tools for enhancing your nervous system and biology and psychology. What are some of those that you've come across, and like how have you used them or experimented with them so far? Or what are some of those things that you're interested in?
Yeah. So this comes from this guy that we both kind of look up to named Andrew Huberman, and they're essentially different kinds of tools. They're behavioral tools, which are just like ways and like practices and techniques that you can use to change yourself from like a alert state to a calm state, for example. And one simple example he gives is like breathing exercises. And so this isn't like a wearable or a tech thing. It's simply like when you breathe deeply, your diaphragm expands and allows for there to be more space around your heart, which slows down your heart rate. When you exhale, it increases. I might have got that backwards, but basically like the principle is that like your breathing has an effect on your heart rate. And if the way that works, one thing he recommends is a double inhale, which sounds like hyperventilating, but like a more intentional way of doing it, where you can increase your focus and alertness very quickly by just inhaling twice, which is extremely easy to do and like just an easy practice, and is a way to just trick your body almost into getting into a more alert state. Yeah, so that's one category.
I like that. Yeah, I think I listened to the same podcast. I think it was on I think it's called Impact Theory with Tim Bilyeu, where he mentioned that one. It's funny that you bring up the topic of breathing, because I think this is something else that's going to blow up in the next 10 years or so, hopefully. I think one person that's been very popular is Wim Hof, who has his like Wim Hof breathing technique, which is also inspired a little bit by an ancient Indian breathing meditation technique called prana, is breath in Sanskrit. I think I may be wrong about that, but that's at least what I remember. And then there's also a bunch of techniques that I've done. So I've experienced with all of these, and there's another one in Qigong breathing. And I think a lot of these, like the Wim Hof breathing techniques, is essentially to try to hyper-oxygenate your body by breathing in through your mouth a lot, in like taking these very deep inhales with your mouth and having like shallow exhales where you're not like completely exhaling, but you're just like almost like letting go. And then that just puts you in a really sympathetic state where you're feeling energetic, you're feeling good. And there's been some interesting studies out there. Joe Rogan had someone on his podcast a couple of months ago that talked about the difference between like mouth breathing and nose breathing, and how it kind of affects people. I think people who have problems snoring might know about this already, or there's been some writing about it, where when you're breathing through your mouth, you often see that's why when you're running, you're in a sympathetic state, you breathe through your mouth. But when you want to be in a parasympathetic state, more focus, breathing into your nose helps you do that better. And so it's interesting how to link that breathing. Breathing is so fundamental that like it's good that we're learning more about it now, but how that can actually affect, say you're very nervous before a talk and you're like jittery or something, doing those nose breaths or those double inhales can actually calm you down a little bit. And similarly in different like Hindu meditation techniques, the amount for which you hold your inhale versus your exhale can also help put you in a sudden, or push you towards a sudden more calm or less stressful state. Whereas if you want to get hyped up, breathing in through your mouth and stuff like that'll get you wanting to be active and wanting to, if you want to play sports or go to the gym or something, that's usually good to get you in a very hyped up state.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that another connection to breathing that's really popular right now is meditation. And a lot of the time, if you subscribe to Headspace or Calm or any of these popular apps, they'll have you focus on your breathing as a way to just focus your attention. And I think like this relates back to another type of tool to affect your nervous system, which are like actual tech that I'm really excited about. And so at the beginning, we talked through this like Neuroscience headband, which measures your brainwaves. And the output of it is basically on a scale of 1 to 10. You can think, how calm are you and how focused are you? And let's just ignore the details of what exactly that means and pretend that's like what, when you think of calm, it actually measures that.
Yeah.
With meditation, I think one of the hardest things and what these apps have addressed is like, how do you track your progress? Because even if you do it consistently, it's very subjective, sort of like whether you're getting better or not. And one of the things I'm really excited about is these devices being able to help you actually measure how, like, to what degree and how much time you spend in meditative state, how fast it took you to get there, and sort of what is the depth of it, for example. Like all these questions are things that we're going to start being able to quantify. And I think that'll get people much more into it, because it's hard to work on something when it's purely subjective. Oh, I feel like that was a good session, as opposed to something you can work on and see progress in, which for better or for worse is what motivates a lot of people in our society. And so like, I think being able to measure new things and being able to measure different aspects of your cognitive state is going to be really fundamental to, as I said before, people taking their cognitive state much more seriously, and through that kind of thinking about everything else that affects it, whether it's environment, lights, music, as we said, or your diet, your sleep, right? It'll be super clear, like after you sleep for 8 hours versus 5 hours, like how that then translates to your focus throughout the day, not just on a subjective level. Wow, I felt really tired, but you're going to have real stats and a quantifiable impact on like how much more tired you were and how much less you were able to accomplish.
I think that's super interesting. I was gonna bring up, I know there's one, meditation is an interesting topic for that kind of stuff, because I think that if you're doing it purely, I do think it's important to have, we talked about earlier, let me gather my thoughts on this. So we talked about earlier how it's easier to measure the impact of some of these wearables and things that can actually track your mental state in things like sports, where there's a very clear outcome. There's a time that you run, there's how many 3-pointers you can get or something like that.
Right.
Whereas in the everyday work, it's a lot more difficult to task. It reminds me of the distinction between making something deliberate practice, where there's a very clear outcome, you have very clear feedback, and these kinds of technologies helping to bring activities more towards a place where you can see them as like deliberate practice, where there is a clear feedback loop, there is something you can measure and how to tell whether you're like on the mark or not. One thought that comes to mind, and I'm not sure where this is going to go or how productive it is like that kind of it could lead people to obsessing over the metrics of it. Like I think you and I have talked a little bit about this idea of like metricifying something, where you're just worried about, like I see people sometimes when they first get like the Aura Ring or posting on Twitter where it's like, oh yeah, I got this amount of deep sleep or something like that, where your emotional state then becomes hooked on this metric that is supposed to be an indicator rather than the end goal of the activity. So that's something, I don't know, I guess it's difficult to prevent it, but I do think as long as you can keep something as a measure rather than a target, i.e. to meditate and say, oh, I can actually measure whether or not I had a good session, versus to say, oh, I need to be 40% in this brain state, only then will I have had a good session. So that's interesting.
I think you really hit the nail on the head of the nail. I don't know the
nail on the head, yeah.
Nail on the head. I always mess that up. Where you add a metric and a lot of people initially become outcomes focused, and that really ruins it in a sense, because I guess this comes to one book I read recently that I have been putting off for a long time, was Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's Flow. And that's his whole thing, is you really will only, if you think too much about outcome, and this kind of common like aphorism that's used, like process over outcome, right? Like you have to learn to enjoy the process, because the outcome is not in your control, whereas the process is, in a sense. And so I think it's like it's a hard mindset shift to make, but anytime you introduce a metric, it's very easy to fall into the trap of trying to maximize that without taking into consideration that, like, if I were to think about how I, in my life, imagine like fast forward 5 years and EEG headsets integrated with meditation apps are more heavily accepted. For me, it wouldn't be about like trying to spend the most amount of time in meditation. I would be really like in a meditative state. I wouldn't be upset if like I spent like a minute less today than yesterday. It's more about, in his conception, what makes for a flow inducing activity is you have to have a couple of characteristics to it, and a lot of things that like people really deeply enjoy have the characteristics of as you said, deliberate practice. It relates back to this, like clear feedback, just goals that you can strive towards, a challenge to skill ratio, so some sort of challenge. And that's hard to set up with meditation currently, because there's just so little to go off of. It's purely subjective. There are no benchmarks. And if you don't look at the benchmark so much as the goal, but just a way for you to deliberately practice and try to get better at something, then like that mindset shift, I think, makes it super powerful and will accelerate not only your progress with it, but also make it really deeply fulfilling to practice meditation. Whereas sometimes it feels like, why am I doing this? I don't feel any effects in my life. And that's trying to make it too kind of outcomes focused, and I want to be more focused throughout the day, so I'm going to meditate. sometimes ruins that. Whereas if you really truly enjoy just like getting better at meditation, that's like the key in my mind to getting the most out of it. Yeah.
100%. I think the characteristic that stood out to me the most from the book Flow and like what constitutes a flow state is that idea of something being intrinsically rewarding and intrinsically enjoyable to do. It reminds me of you and I have both gone on this journey of writing newsletters and essays and doing a podcast and stuff like that. And the more that I've focused on just the intrinsic value of producing something and creating something and being of hopefully this thing that we're creating is useful to some people versus the outcome of people going to look at this and how many people are going to look at this and stuff like that. By focusing on that intrinsic reward of I'm going to do this even if I'm going to do this for its own sake, that actually helps you. That kind of takes the anxiety away and helps you enjoy it more and probably produces better outcomes as well. But that definitely helps with the flow state there.
Yeah. And to dig into this idea a little bit more, one book that I recently came out by Seth Godin called The Practice.
I love it. Yeah, it's really good. What did you think of it?
I just thought it helped me conceptualize like some things that I had in the back of my mind, but didn't have the perfect words to put into words is what I mean. And one of the biggest things that stuck out to me from that book is that like, first of all, just like following your curiosity as a means to just finding enjoyment from these things and like not focusing so much on the outcomes because that's not something you can control, but you can just try to be better, like, and just try to become a better writer, not only for yourself, but he reframes it in an interesting way that it took me a long time to understand is like for us, like writing or recording these podcasts, in our case, it's something that we're able to create change in other people. And that's almost the goal. And it's like a generous act to try to teach other people and anything you learn, try to package it in a way that can help other people. And for a while, I thought that was a little weird because I don't think like everything has to be generous, but at the same time, like the core is that like he calls it like art, like any form of creation, right? Like art is what we call it when we're able to create something new that changes someone. And I thought that was like, it really blew my mind. It's so hard to define art, but within the context that we're talking about, it is so helpful. And that what I'm trying to do with my newsletter is change people, right? If it doesn't change people, then it's not worthwhile. If they just read it and they're like, cool, then that's much less valuable than if they read it and they think differently about how they do a certain thing in their life or how they view whatever. Yeah.
I really love the book. I'm really glad that you brought it up. I think one thing I like about it is almost has it's a very reassuring and very calming tone to it about why do you create and what is it about what is it about questioning yourself or the anxiety that comes with creating art in this case, and how can you not just overcome that, but understand that this is part of the process and situated in a larger context of this is why you're doing something. And one of the things that I love from that book is this whole idea of being an imposter and like why that's a necessary component because you're doing something that's never done before. Of course, you're not going to feel confident about it. Yeah, I think it's just wonderful with so many gems in it. I definitely encourage people to check that out.
One of my favorite psychological facts, just really quickly from that, changed my mind. He said, your work is too important to be left to how you feel today. On the other hand, committing to an action can change how you feel. And if we act as though we trust the process and do the work, then the feelings will follow. So I think it's really important, ties into so many other kind of similar ideas about from the Strong Fit podcast, for example, where like the action has to be the first thing, like even and the feeling follows. Like you're never in a state like you're rarely going to find yourself in a state where you're like really just excited to write. Like you just have to sit down and do it, and then that gets you excited to write. And I just that really changed the way my process works and unlocked like a lot of energy that I didn't have otherwise. Yeah. So just want to throw that out there.
Totally agree. We should sit down and talk about, just have a podcast on that book in the future. I wanted to, let's close up one of the topics that we began, which was like interesting startups in the space that's like doing things around the brain or wearables and stuff like that. You mentioned two of them. So Endel, was the one that it creates like customized soundscapes, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then the other one was Neurosity, which was the Notion headset that you pointed out. What are some other ones that you think are interesting that people can learn about and that you've come across?
Yeah, and I just want to contextualize Neurosity. They're not so much for the everyday person yet. They're really targeting developers who are trying to be way more structured about their focus throughout the day and how they're coding. And I just bought it because I'm really into kind of the tools and an early adopter in this space.
I was going to say, it seems like something I need to research and pick up because, yeah, I'm surprised that I don't have one yet. So I'll definitely pick one up and let you know how it is.
Well, it's a steep price, so I'll just warn you ahead of time. Another startup that in the music space I was really interested in is called Weave Music, and they are trying to change how we conceptualize music from a static recording to something that's more dynamic. And so they're building tools to help artists record music and make a record that works at different tempos. And so their first proof of concept app is this running app. And what it does is based on how fast you're running, what pace you're running, it changes the tempo of the song using their own kind of proprietary tool. And the songs they've changed into this adaptive format changes it to match your pace of running. And psychologically, like you just feel less pain. And there are a couple other things like facilitate the process of running when your music is matched that speed. And that's almost besides the point, just a proof of concept, like why this is valuable. They just want to transform how music is made, and that you can listen to the same Jay-Z song in a calm setting in like a jazz bar and also at a club, for example.
That's very cool.
I think that I'm really excited about the future of music. And I think there's so much like this kind of AI generated music that I think is really interesting, especially for kind of focus and relaxation purposes. But then there's also like these people trying to reconceptualize what music is, which blows my mind every time.
Totally. I was going to say it's probably not as deep, but I've been experimenting with like TikTok in the past few weeks. And the core of that application is around sound and music. And it's surprising how addictive it is because it has that component versus Instagram is addicting enough. It's like just visual and like overwhelming your senses. But this, it's really powerful. And to see how different companies are saying, you know, how can we actually use this component of music and play around with it in the case of, you said it was Brain FM, right?
Yeah. Weave Music.
Weave Music. Sorry. I'm looking at the wrong notes. So Weave Music, I think it's just super fascinating. Looking forward to see how that turns out. Speaking of Brain FM, what does Brain FM do?
Yeah, they're similar to Endo in the sense that they make music to help you focus. They use like they're not based on circadian rhythms. They're actually based on a different line of research that basically modulates your brain waves to be at the level of, they basically figured out what is the brainwave signature of focus and using music to prime that in your brain, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Very interesting. To induce a flow state.
Yeah. And I used to use them a little bit, but I'm more into Endo because there's a lot of creative elements to it. And I tend to get a little bored of Brain FM's music, but both are, I think, like equally interesting in the space. Yeah.
Two things to check out. Are they both, is like Endel and Brain FM just like websites that you can visit and stream music from?
I think they both have free trials, but they are paid. So I will say that it's not free.
Yeah. Sure, people can check out the free trial and see if they like it. So one person, so just changing gears onto some more like general topics. We've chatted so much about the brain and neuroscience and how it relates to life. I think this experiment has worked out pretty well in my opinion. I'm not sure how you feel about it. One of the people that you mentioned earlier was Andrew Huberman as someone that's inspiring you and helping you live better. What about him do you find so interesting and inspiring? And could you just tell us a little bit about some of maybe his favorite work that you've found engaging?
Yeah, I think he inspires me from the sense of he studies the biology of optimal cognition. So thinking about how we can optimize our cognitive states and along those lines, and using, unlike other people, he is a professor at Stanford, is very kind of science backed in everything he does. And I think, he's actually starting a podcast soon that I think has a really interesting format where rather than each episode being standalone, like for a month, he's going to do a deep dive into a certain topic and then explore it from different angles in different podcast episodes. So I just think he's doing like a lot of great work as a science communicator, and that inspires me. And just his attitude around it, where I don't like care to be the point of focus. Like I just get so excited about science, like everything I learned from books and experiments and discussions with colleagues, that I just want to share it and package it for people in an understandable way so they can live their lives better. Is like when I heard that, I was like, that is exactly what I was trying to do with my newsletter. And I just need to steal word for word that and apply it to my own context. So he's an inspiration as a science communicator foremost. And then his research, obviously, also extremely interesting.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll link to a couple of episodes, or at least interviews that he's done. I'm not sure by the time this is out, maybe his podcast will be out. I'll double check. But yeah, I found that fascinating about him as well. It's interesting how you mentioned that like he's not trying to be the focus of attention. Like I listened to, I guess it's like a 2.5 hour interview with him, and he's never say the breakthrough that I made in my research or something. It's more always like from this other research, and then in my lab we try to do this, and this is what we found. And it's very much focused on, as you mentioned, the science and the breakthroughs and what's interesting. And you can see this guy is just really fascinated about the work. He can talk about it for hours and hours.
Mm-hmm.
And I got into him through one of the interviews that he did about the neuroscience of optimal performance, again, from a performance aspect. And then you get dragged down into the neuroscience rabbit hole where you're exploring all kinds of different things. It's interesting. He talked a lot about simulating fear and like what that does in people. And there's some other interesting things in that particular episode about, I think he calls it the download after you sleep, which is why like you shouldn't check your phone first thing in the morning, and trying to be in these states where the state where you've just woken up, and how do you tap that, which is it's interesting for people who want to check that out. You mentioned something about science communication, and it's funny, I'm listening to this masterclass, or there's a course on the app called Masterclass by Neil deGrasse Tyson on that concept of science communication. And one of the things we mentioned before we started recording was this idea about how do you go about explaining complicated things or scientific material in a really easily accessible way that everyday person can understand. And this is something that you do very well in your newsletter. Folks want to check out Friday Brainstorm. There'll be a link in the show notes to check that out. So you do a wonderful job at that. I'm curious about how you actually go about making these scientific concepts digestible to people. You deal with neuroscience in your case, and what are some practices that you found to be particularly useful that have worked out well?
Yeah, so I think thank you for the compliment, by the way. It's just really interesting to me to consider how a lot of science is this complicated thing, and a lot of people in academia just have a hard time communicating with people outside of their specialty area. And I think that's a real shame. And I've like over time realized like I want my contribution not to be necessarily to do cutting edge research, but to figure out different ways of packaging this information in a way that like people can understand. And one of the most powerful ways to package a complex idea in my mind is using metaphors. And what I mean by that is, I can give an example. So in Western culture, there's a metaphor of time as money, right? Like we quantify time, we think of it in discrete amounts. Like our language even reflects that. It's like, we just wasted time. We spent time on this. And it's so ingrained in us, we don't realize. But
that's actually such a good point. Yeah.
That's how we view time. But like in other cultures, they might view time as like a river, right? Like time as something that like passes, and we're like observers of it almost. And I think it's like super interesting, first of all, like from a linguistic sense, like how so ingrained it is in our culture, but also how different conceptions can exist in different cultures and how that affects the way we think about something as central as time. But I guess like on a meta level, these metaphors help not only highlight certain aspects about time. So like the money metaphor for time highlights that it's discrete, it could be measured, that it could be spent, but it hides the fact that time is like always flowing, like that it like continuous, and all these other things that you would associate with a river. And so in a way, a metaphor is a tool to highlight and hide certain parts of a concept. And so I found it super useful for explaining things like we were talking earlier about Ayurvedic medicine, but I call it biological Wi-Fi. Magnetic fields that our cells emit it's just really hard to wrap your head around. But if you think about it from the perspective of Wi-Fi, which is something that's much closer to something we understand, like you could think of each cell as like a Wi-Fi router, and
Yeah.
it's things, it allows them to communicate to others. There's a certain range to them. The farther away you get, the less information is conveyed, the closer you are. Like all these things are intuitive if we just think of it as Wi-Fi. But if I try to explain to you purely from a scientific lens what is happening on a cellular basis, it just makes less sense.
Yeah.
So it's like linguistics and being creative about how you choose your examples and metaphor theory all packaged in one, but like one really effective tool to explain something, considering a frame of reference that the reader might already have.
I 1,000,000% agree. One of the things, like when I was, I've written about this a little before. When I was at Princeton, I was a learning consultant, and one of the things I thought a lot about, we would pontificate about what is learning and what exactly are we trying to help people to do. And my definition of learning that I came up with is just connecting something that you don't know to something that you already know. And I think implicit in the metaphor, as you just said, considering a frame of reference that the reader is familiar with, is just that. Like that is the core of learning, is to take something in a concept that people are familiar with and you know how it works. And then you attach this totally new thing to say, okay, here's a context in which you understand, and here's some shared characteristics that these two things have, so that you can actually understand it better and actually have a better, I don't want to use the word understanding, but you actually can more intuitively grasp and understand what this thing does.
And especially in different contexts too, right? Like not only context which you learned in, but just having a understanding of the properties of something on a more general level, in which you could see that there are similarities between it and something else, allows you to more easily jump, like, how does this concept that I learned in one area then apply in this other area, which I think is like a higher level understanding of things. And oftentimes most of what you're learning stops at the level of how it explains to you in one context, but doesn't give you enough of a mental scaffolding to think about, okay, how does this apply in other areas? Which
exactly,
I think, it's way harder, but so much more satisfying to be able to give people mental architecture and mental models to understand something on a level that deep.
Exactly. Yeah, because that's the end goal, is you want to help people transfer. You don't just want them to understand the concept in one context and then just be like limited by it. But it's the same thing like when you're trying to learn maths or something like that. You don't just want to learn one problem, but you want to learn how to apply that technique in a service of solving like another bigger problem or something like that. Whole skill of transferring your skill to different contexts is, I guess that's one of the gold standards of learning. And it's interesting you mentioned about time. I was listening to this lecture about Hinduism and Zen Buddhism and stuff like that. And they actually made a very similar comparison where they said time is cyclical in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, whereas in the Western traditions, time is very linear. And so it's interesting because to think about that, you said time is money, how these metaphors and how you actually understand things and implicit in life. Because I think there's a lot of hype around first principles thinking. Elon Musk has popularized this and people are all trying to learn things from the ground up. I think that's good for certain things, but I think learning by metaphor actually gets to the root of how you learn. And that's why I think it's too powerful a technique to be discounted, because if you have enough metaphors and if you can connect it to different things, that actually increases your understanding, because again, it's not just isolated in this one area, but you're connecting different parts of your learning and how you understand things. I know this is one reason why you like Rome research. You can connect it to all the different things that you use. But yeah, I think that's something people can definitely apply.
Yeah, and it's funny that you say this first principles thing, that like we have to consider is below your first principles, there are almost these like cognitive artifacts of which how we consider the world. And one super interesting book that's like extremely dense, I don't know how many people out there would be really into it, but it's called Metaphors We Live By George Lakoff. And it was the seminal book, and kind of like the example I gave about time is money versus time is like a river, like a river. Like that's where it originated from. And he was the first one to think about like how our language structures how we think. And so if you're stopping at the level of like first principles, then that's limited by your culture's first principles and how you're sort of
Exactly.
like how you're
Yeah.
conceptualizing things. Whereas if you think about it from, and he breaks it down, the author, it's 600 pages of different like basically like metaphors for up versus down, like
Yeah.
farther or near, like these like just extremely fundamental things about how we like interact with the world, and then using that as a toolbox almost to then build up to how we understand different things and how different things relate to each other. Super fascinating. I actually got 100 pages through the book. I was like, I got the main idea. I
This is
don't
a lot.
really
Yeah.
need to read through every single minute example, but yeah.
I definitely will check that out. That's something very interesting. I did some thinking about the effects of language and our ability to conceptualize things. And mainly when I lived in Costa Rica, this international school, we had people from all over the world. And I would have these conversations with some of my friends whose first language wasn't English. And they would talk about like how they thought about something like maths in their native language versus in English. And how like when they would do something, so they would, it's funny because we both had a shared reference of, okay, we want to solve this maths problem. And like, what are you doing and how am I thinking about it versus how they're thinking about it. But we had the shared language of the numbers, and he can show me like, this is what we're trying to do and this is why. And I can reason back how he thought about it. So again, something really fascinating. I definitely want to dig into that a little more and do some more reading on it.
Yeah.
Want to move into some quick fire questions because I know we've talked about so much in this podcast. So the name of the podcast is Learn with Avthar, and we're all about trying to learn new things and gain some more perspective and understanding in our lives. So what's something that you've recently learned that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah. One thing that I've recently read into that just blew my mind has been basically the extent to which like we all have different like inner experiences, if that makes sense. And so the way that I realized it is when I read books, I don't have visual representations that come up as I read, whereas a lot of people do. I don't really know where that comes from, but that just means I read in a very symbolic way and almost interpret it differently than somebody who might visualize things. And I get a lot less enjoyment from like fiction books, for example, because I don't have that like world painted in my mind. But one interesting application of this that really just crazy to me is fiction writers. Actually, there are certain fiction writers who also in the same boat as me who construct these like magnificent intricate worlds that people get lost in, but they themselves like are not the type of people to see that. And it was really interesting like the techniques they use to emulate that. They like put themselves in the shoes of their character, and they call like a 360 technique where they just look around and try to describe what the character sees, and in essence like they like replicate what people normally have in that sense. And there was also research done that like certain writers can almost speak to their characters like as if they were a person. It almost sounds like schizophrenia, but like in a good way for writers, in the sense they can, it's so personified that they can speak to them and intuit like what they would do in certain scenarios, which I thought was crazy and sent me down a whole rabbit hole. Yeah.
So cool. Where did you learn about this from, or was it like in a book that you were reading, or how did you like discover this?
Yeah, I think I was just having a conversation with a friend who was just like so shocked by like how different our inner experiences were. I think I was talking to a friend who, you know, when he thinks, he doesn't have an inner voice. So he just, I guess, whereas I have this inner monologue, let's say. And it didn't occur to me that like other people just have like fundamentally different ways of inner dialogue. I don't know what it is. And that prompted me to just go, what is the science about this? Has this been studied? And yeah.
That's remarkably interesting. I'd love to talk to your friend to learn more about that, because I think similar to you, I have that voice in my head when I'm thinking about things or learning things. Yeah. It's interesting this is a side deviation, when I was learning about this thing called speed reading, where a lot of it is trying to turn off that voice in your head that you've been trained, where like when you learn how to read sometimes, and maybe this is different for you, but when I learned how to read, you learned how to sound things out. You learned the phonetics of it versus to recognize the letter. Because like you read to speak, when you read something, you read it out loud, versus the whole idea of speed reading, as I learned about it, was to read for the meaning. You're not sounding the word out in your head versus you're understanding the meaning of the word in that context. So it reminds me of that when you think about how when two people are reading, there's different mental processes that could go on in their head. even though they're doing the same thing, their eyes are scanning the page and stuff like that. So it reminds me of that.
For sure.
The next question I wanted to ask is, so we talked a ton about neuroscience and how it affects our lives. I'm curious about what blogs or newsletters or other things like podcasts that you enjoyed related to this topic that people can check out.
Yeah. So in terms of blogs, the original inspiration for my blog was Tim Urban, Wait But Why. Very famous, kind of one of the original bloggers in not necessarily a science space, but he's a very funny guy who incorporates a lot of visuals and comics into his writing. And he's my inspiration in terms of breaking down complex ideas. Like a lot of the mental models I have for that come from him. He posts like every once in a while, like he's very sporadic, but great in that sense. One newsletter I'd like to point out, this is someone that I've gotten to know by writing a newsletter in science, Clayton Mansell. He's applying to MD PhD programs and is focused on being a better science communicator, has actually been featured on Substack and had immense success with this newsletter, and every week kind of writes, whereas I focus more on like mental and cognitive things, he focuses more on kind of the biological and like purely scientific side. And so if you really like that, his newsletter called Synapse is really great. And then one podcast that I've been really enjoying is, I think to me, I every single like interview based podcast is interesting in its own way because the host has like different personalities and the types of questions they ask for. And the one that I've been enjoying most in terms of how they interview neuroscientists is Lex Friedman, who's a professor at MIT. And I think he just, sometimes when you listen to a podcast, like there's so much satisfaction from just the host asking the same question that you had in your mind that you would want to ask the guests that they have on. And he, like for me at least, does that every single time, where he really digs deep and asks really profound, like not only kind of basic science questions, but philosophical questions from a lot of the guests that he has on. Yeah.
Totally. I'm a huge fan of the Lex Friedman podcast as well. Yeah, great recommendations, by the way. One very clear recommendation for every kind. I'm curious about what books are you currently reading related to the topics that we were talking about, if you want to share any of them.
Let me pull up my Goodreads. One book that I've really been enjoying recently is called Transcend. And if you ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it is like a seminal concept that people learn in intro to psych classes, has been supposedly grossly misrepresented over time. And this guy, Scott Barry Kaufman, rewrites the book and goes through these like letters and correspondences that Maslow went through and wrote, and incorporates the last 50 years of science and everything we learned into give a new metaphor for how to understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yeah, and I think it's super interesting because it's like in the same way that like learning about flow has taught me a lot about how to find fulfillment in life. Maslow's work is about how to help people reach their potential, and that his work is just like on a level super interesting. So that's a book I would recommend. And then I've been reading Ted Chiang, who's a phenomenal sci-fi writer. He writes short stories that are a little bit like Black Mirror, if people are into that, but a little less dystopian, I would say. So that's like a fiction recommendation I would have.
Super cool. I definitely want to check out the book. You said it's called Transcend, right?
Yeah, by Scott Barry Kaufman.
Awesome. Definitely something I'm going to pick up. And then lastly, where can people find you if they want to learn more about the stuff that you're doing and follow along as you keep communicating about neuroscience and how it can help them better their lives?
Yeah, thank you. So I have a website, shamay.com. That's SHAMAY. And then also Friday Brainstorm newsletter. I recently released a podcast that I'm actually keeping quiet about because I want to basically get through like 10 episodes where I figure out how to do a podcast before publicizing it too much. But it's called Mind Gym if anyone is interested. There are a couple episodes out.
Awesome. We'll only include a link once you pass 10 episodes to that, just to keep it a secret for a little bit. But yeah, Shamay, this was excellent. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I know one of the things we tried to do here was be less interviewee and more kind of conversational in the topics. And yeah, it was great fun, great experiment. Thank you so much for coming on and being such a willing interlocutor in this conversation that we had. I've learned so much just from talking about the different concepts.
It's always a pleasure talking with you. I appreciate being on.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone at home for listening. We're going to wrap it up right here.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Learn with Avthar. I really do hope you've enjoyed it. If you've learned something from this episode, please subscribe on YouTube, review it with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, or just tell your friends and family about this new interesting podcast you've discovered called Learn with Avthar. I want to show you one quick thing before you go. If those of you on YouTube, you're able to see it on the screen. If not, audio, I'll describe it. You can go watch it on YouTube channel Avthar Sirathan. But I just wanted to show you something in case you're not aware of it. If I can find my share screen button. All right, what I wanted to show you was this. It's called Avthar's Weekly Wisdom. Every week I write a newsletter where I share practical wisdom about self-mastery, startups and investing and business, as well as health and happiness. My guarantee is that you'll discover one thing that can change your life every week. The newsletter is called Avthar's Weekly Wisdom. You can check it out here. You can see I talk about topics, sharing the podcasts that I found most interesting, essays that I've written. You'll also get new podcasts that I release. And you'll also find things like my essential reading list for 2021 and my favorite annual review questions. These are just some of the articles that I've released in the past couple of weeks. So if you like it, go and check it out at avthar.com. That's avthar.com. Put in your email address there, and you'll start receiving new newsletter editions every Sunday. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you on another episode of Learn with Avthar very soon.